Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. Today I thought we would launch one of the things that I've been kind of wanting to do for a long time, and that is a book club. So there are two main reasons why I've wanted to do this for so long. Mostly the first one, which is just purely academic, which is that I'm going to be doing the reading anyway. I have to read a lot of books to produce a lot of the content that we do. So if I'm going to read the books anyway, I figured I might as well talk about the books themselves and do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of these sources that we use for some of the other stuff that we do. And what better way to do that than to teach it? Because if you teach something, then you are sure to actually have mastered the information if you know it well enough to be able to convey it to someone else. And the other reason is just more along the lines of I've kind of wanted to do it. I thought that this might be a good way for us to learn a lot of new information together. We're always talking about how we need to learn a lot of information these days. We're really behind the power curve when it comes to the amount of information that the average citizen just knows. Like, we've got to get smart on a lot of topics. And I thought, what better way to do that than to talk about some of the books that kind of make that possible. So this is kind of an inside look at how a lot of the research gets done for some of our other stuff, but also a little bit more condensed way to talk about some of these sources. And today we're going to be starting the series off with the book as chosen by our supporters, which is Spymaster, Startling Cold War Revelations of a Soviet KGB Chief. What better way to start off than by talking about a good spy novel, right? So before we get into the actual book itself, I did want to mention the format. I'm having to use the digital format this time. I prefer to have a physical book in hand most of the time, because then I can make a lot more clear notes, and it's a little bit easier for me to show you some of my notes, where it's a little bit complicated to export notes from a e-reader kind of device like this one. We'll do the best we can, so you may see me refer back to this at times to show some of the annotations that I've made within this, but I also have paper notes as well, which are usually what I prefer to use to take notes. So let's get right to it. As with all historical books of a biographical nature, we have to talk about first the author. The author of this book is kind of twofold, and this really points out some of the differences with how this is kind of a unique book. So the author is Tenant Bagley. This is a well-known CIA agent from the Cold War. Post-collapse of the USSR, upon his retirement, he became one of the leading authors on some of the more well-known espionage stories of the Cold War. Bagley ended up doing the biography for Sergei Kondrashev, which is what this book is. Spymaster is essentially an unauthorized biography of Sergei Kondrashev, which was ironically his counterpart in the KGB at the same time. So that's one of the things that we have to consider, again, is with all historical documents, we have to consider the source. Technically, almost all biographies are secondary sources, meaning the primary source, the person that the biography is about, is conveying their life and anecdotes to a secondary source, who is the author of the book. In this case, it's a little bit special because this book is unauthorized. This book contains anecdotes and stories straight from Sergei Kondrashev, the primary source, as told after his death. Sergei Kondrashev actually wrote his own book, and he has actually had several, I think, biographies, sort of, made about him prior to his death. But after his death, Tenant Bagley, who he had worked with before for a lot of other works, actually saved all of those notes that were unauthorized, that the Russian intelligence services would not let be published before. After Sergei died, his works could then be published with the permission of his family. So Tenant Bagley wanted to get some of Kondrashev's stories out, and that could not happen while Kondrashev was alive. And his estate, his family, agreed to allow these notes to be published, which is why you get kind of a unique inside story that's not as watered down as in previous tellings of Kondrashev's life. Now, we'll talk more about this at the end, because this does not necessarily mean that it is a shocking tell-all, like as is sort of revealed on the cover, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But when it comes to the sources, like I mentioned, we have to treat this a little bit special. When it comes to first-hand sources, primary sources, straight from the horse's mouth, we can treat them a little bit differently than secondary sources, somebody who is hearing the story. However, with this particular book, because it's this unique thing, it's written by Tenant Bagley, the secondary source, but it includes basically deathbed confessions, so to speak, of Sergei Kondrashev. We can kind of treat this as somewhere between a primary and secondary source. So it's kind of a unique source if you're trying to cite it academically. Like I mentioned, the overview of this book is that it is the biography of Sergei Kondrashev, who was a very high-ranking KGB chief during the war. Most of the book is told in vignettes, so each chapter is basically a story that Sergei Kondrashev was able to actually relate to Tenant Bagley, the author, who then, of course, turned it into this book. You would think that the book follows Kondrashev from his very entrance into the intelligence services, but it doesn't really. It starts off basically with him joining the KGB, but it kind of glosses over that. So basically, we meet Kondrashev in the book as he is already more or less an intelligence agent, a case officer of some kind, right? Because of this, I think, and we'll again get to this at the end of the book, I think that we jump right into the action. So it's really kind of a page turner right to start with. A lot of the more interesting stuff in the book comes at the beginning of the book, I think. Because of that, it's a very easy read if you have a very primitive, basic understanding of the Cold War. If you are brand new to the Cold War, if you don't understand anything about it other than, like the memes or just kind of a general view of what it was, you may not want to start with this book. This really kind of assumes that you're going to understand some of how the KGB operated. Because of this, when we start talking a lot about the very, very deep and complicated spy stuff, it's really difficult to actually keep track of some of these names. So that might be a common problem for like new readers if you don't really, or if you're not really used to reading some of the more in-depth books out there. You might find it quite challenging. By the time you get to the middle of the book, there are dozens of names that you kind of have to keep track of. And the author, because this is his subject area, doesn't necessarily do a super great job at reminding us of who certain people are. They're just kind of mentioned, and then you have to flip back and a few pages to figure out who's this guy again. So that's some of the challenges when reading this book. Now let's break things down and actually go over each chapter and some of the meat and potatoes of what is worth taking away from each of the vignettes as they're told in this story. First of all, the preface kind of gives us what I've already kind of explained. This is a very unique document that is published after Kondrashev's death with the permission of his family, his surviving family, and it is supposed to include a lot of things that were not authorized for publishing by not necessarily KGB, but in modern day, the Russian intelligence services. Now, I can attest to that, just kind of a mild spoiler, though. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking throughout the entire novel. There are a few things that are very interesting because they confirm what we kind of know already from history. A lot of the stuff about specific sources and whether or not someone was a KGB agent. Well, Kondrashev will basically confirm that they were a KGB agent. They were one of our guys, which is something that we've kind of known for a very long time. But having Kondrashev kind of confirm it on his deathbed is kind of helpful for other research that you might be doing. So that's pretty much the preface. Getting into the first chapter, we start talking about one of the breakout roles of Kondrashev. So we kind of, like I mentioned, we meet him sort of in his career where he's already starting to work sources. And one of the incidents that put Kondrashev on the map was his turning of an American code technician for the American embassy. So his recruitment of an American code clerk, which was codenamed Jack, it details his story. Now, I'm glad that the author put this chapter right up front because this is a classic story of how most sources were recruited by the USSR. It's got everything, the classic approaches, the honeypots. It's got a good overview of how the KGB went about recruiting most of their human sources. So like I mentioned, this is a good story to start with. We break from this story once Jack has been kind of recruited, and we learn about his story and how the KGB kind of took care of him and all that kind of stuff in a good way. They really did try their best to make sure that he was taken care of and treated very well throughout his espionage career. But we shift quite significantly for Chapter 2, which is titled Two Views of Culture. So Kondrashev, one of his main roles throughout his career was becoming a cultural advisor via Vox, VOKS, which was the Russian sort of cultural society to spread Russian culture throughout the world. Well, as you might imagine, this was really just a cultural agency in name only. It was all the KGB. So one of the main ways that spies on both sides of the aisle, both the CIA and the KGB, one of the ways that they could get a spy into country was to be a cultural analyst. This is why, if you ever watch that TV show The Americans, the series starts with, of course, these Soviet deep cover agents being travel agents, right? So that's one of the great ways that you could explain foreign travel. You could explain knowing both English and Russian. You could get away with a lot of stuff under the guise of spreading culture when, in essence, it was all espionage. So this is what we get from Chapter 2. We also briefly are introduced to Kondrashev's wife and the story where he just basically meets her by chance and decides that this is the woman he's going to marry. So they both, the feeling was mutual, and they both ended up basically getting married, and that's kind of it. That's kind of the story there. This also begins his career in counterintelligence. So Kondrashev played a pretty decent role in spy hunting, as his duties as cultural advisor when he was not overseas. His cultural jobs were to watch and consume Western media, along with, more importantly, Russian media, to make sure that under Stalin, who was the general secretary at the time, Stalin personally approved most film or movies at the time. So Kondrashev's department was kind of a way of Stalin kind of keeping tabs on the media, right? So Stalin was very particular about certain things. He would even say, like, we need to remove this scene from this movie, or this line from the script needs to go away, or this whole plot needs to go away, and we need to redo the whole thing. So Stalin was very invested in that, and Kondrashev offers us a peek as to behind the curtain regarding some of the censorship roles. Moving on down Kondrashev's career, we move to number 3, where he is first given his chance to target the American embassy in Moscow. So this is a very interesting chapter. I think it was probably one of the more interesting chapters in the book, because it details some of the lengths that the KGB will go through, and the KGB went through, in order to get a source. Kondrashev had identified a target working at the American embassy, a great target for exploitation. If they could ever get him out of his house, they might want to put a tap on his phone and bug some of the things in his house to kind of get a better idea of this guy and see if whether or not he was worthy of approach or exploitation or whatever. So you can see how Kondrashev just kind of tacitly and just sort of casually mentions some of the stuff that perhaps we would have done better to get some more details on. But in any way, Kondrashev slips into his profession, right? And he notices a point of entry, a point of exploitation. And in this case, rather than being the classic honeypot, because this guy was married, they found out that one of the great ways to get this guy was through his cat. So the KGB had cooked up a special poison that the housekeeper, special eye drops, that when the housekeeper dropped the eye drops in the cat's eye, it caused the cat's eye to bug out like freakishly, and the target's wife, of course, seeing the cat with this freakishly bulging out eyeball, immediately runs the cat to the vet, leaving the house empty so that Kondrashev and his associates can slip into this unoccupied house, plant a bunch of surveillance stuff, and then get back out again. This is one of those stories that just kind of highlights how truth is often stranger than fiction, and we understand how Ian Fleming of James Bond fame got a lot of the weird and wacky kind of stories and gadgets and plot devices for his James Bond series. We can see how they were inspired by real life a lot of times, because this story sounds like it is straight out of a Bond villain book, where it's just the strangest thing you could possibly imagine. The KGB having a secret drug to make a cat's eyeball bulge out so it could freak out its owner and then take that cat to the vet. to get them out of the house so they could plant a bug. That is such a strange and unique story that I thought it was very, very interesting. Another interesting part is how Kondrashev notes something that both the CIA and the KGB shared a problem with at the time and even to this day, and that is they had no shortage of spying tools, bugs, devices, wiretaps, no shortage of that, but they did have a shortage of linguists, people who could actually translate and sit there for hours and hours and hours and listen to all of these tapes and wiretaps. So Kondrashev kind of notes that, which is very, very interesting, considering that is a very timeless problem within the world of espionage. Another story of Chapter 3 that was kind of interesting that kind of points to some of the more active measures. Once we get to the active measures chapter, we kind of start seeing Kondrashev demonstrating his ability and his superior skill for some of the more darker sides of espionage. So this details the story of Kondrashev, actually him and his team getting together to break into the room of Colonel Stig Wennerstrom, who was an American colonel at the time, and they photographed his personal diary very selectively and released that to the world to make it look like NATO was preparing for war. So I thought that was very, very interesting that they were able to do that, and it wasn't until many, many, many years later that we actually found out that it was in fact Kondrashev that had photographed his diary, because this colonel, of course, once this went public in the press, this colonel was fairly certain that his diary had been out of his possession at another time when he was traveling, and that they had nabbed it from his hotel room then, but in actuality they had gotten it much, much earlier, which is very, very interesting. Moving on to Chapter 4, we start to get the inkling feeling that maybe Kondrashev has got some kind of bone to pick, or perhaps is not the most reliable narrator. This is really just a seed that I want to plant now, because this may end up being a little bit of a factor later on. Chapter 4, titled Inside a Deadly Purge, details what the author, Tennant Bagley, and what many, many others who have examined Kondrashev's story would call a miraculous rise throughout the KGB. Now that I've planted that seed, I kind of want to neglect it a little bit, because you get the feeling from this chapter that maybe Kondrashev is up to something, because, as the author points out, thunderbolts kept striking near Kondrashev. Basically, this chapter details the only reasons that Kondrashev got promoted throughout most of his career was because his bosses were shot. That's basically how it works out. Kondrashev missed and avoided a substantial number of purges and other basically just mishaps. It's only through happenstance most of the time that his neck was saved. One of the more interesting stories was that he was working a source, and he had the source. It was a lady. She came to him and just casually mentioned one night during one of their meetings that she had spent a night with Lavrenti Beria, who, if you don't know who that is, a quick Google will let you know that Beria was one of the most infamous leaders throughout the Soviet Union, a truly sickening individual, but a man of considerable power. Kondrashev, realizing that this source would have put him at risk by revealing that she had indeed spent a night with this man, a man of considerable power, just his reaction is summed up by the quote, "Drop her." So basically, his agency and the KGB wrote her into the archives, and never used her as a source ever again when she mentioned that. They did not want that kind of attention brought to their agency, because Beria was just a man, while Stalin was still alive at least, a man of considerable power. Another interesting story was how he was saved by his mother-in-law from her shrewd advice at the right time. This was again during one of the no less than dozen chances and times where Kondrashev's bosses were immediately slapped in irons and interrogated and found to be enemies of the Soviet Union for some totally arbitrary Stalinistic reason, right? And Kondrashev finds himself coming into the office to other senior agents, basically saying, "You will write a statement of denouncement for this man. You will bring us all the evidence on him, and you have that report on my desk tomorrow morning. Well, Kondrashev is now in kind of a pickle in this particular instance because, on the one hand, if he says, well, if he lies, because obviously none of these people were really deserving of Stalin's persecution, especially in the intelligence services. On the one hand, he can say, wait a minute, if I denounce my boss and say that my boss was an incompetent spy or something, something ridiculous this whole time, well, they're just going to come back at me and say, well, if he was so bad, then why did you not denounce him beforehand? Why did you have to wait for us to arrest him first? On the other hand, if he did not denounce them, then his own neck was on the line anyway as potentially a collaborator. So he discussed it over, interestingly enough, with his mother-in-law in their family kitchen, in their apartment kitchen, and she basically points out, hey, look, Sergei, if you denounce this guy, look what happened to all these other people who denounced their bosses, and they didn't have a different fate. They basically shared the same fate as those who they denounced. So Kondrashev basically goes into his office the next day and says, I don't know nothing. I see nothing, right? And he basically said, hey, if you want to talk about my work, that's fine. We can talk about my work and my sources and stuff, but I don't know nothing. I don't know nothing about what my boss was doing. And he did this a couple of times and somehow, miraculously, escaped his fate, because one of his coworkers actually did exactly what he was probably supposed to do, which was denounce his boss, denounce the department head there. And just like his mother-in-law mentioned, that guy who wrote the denouncement was wrapped up too, for completely arbitrary reasons. As we'll find out throughout the rest of this book, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, some of the things the KGB did, because of the Soviet system. For by and large, as we can see, the KGB, the internal intelligence services, particularly counterintelligence, was somewhat insulated from the craziness of the Soviet Union and other aspects of society, but not entirely immune, as we'll get to one particular story here in just a moment. And that story lies within Chapter 5, which is titled Into Foreign Intelligence and London. We meet Kondrashev later on in his career as he is transferred to London for a few different reasons. For one, he was an English speaker and they needed a lot of English-speaking personnel. There was also an unrelated scandal of somewhat minor importance that resulted in a lot of agents rotating home, just due to wanting the KGB always being kind of paranoid and wanting to shake things up. So Kondrashev was transferred to London. This chapter details a lot of some of the more routine spy operations like dead drops, brush passes, money drops, the actions of the bag man for handling cash payments to spies and other espionage targets. So that's kind of an interesting thing if you're into that. There's not a whole lot of tradecraft that's talked about in this book, so this is one of those chapters where this is mentioned. But by far the most interesting story in this chapter, and perhaps the whole book, is what I call the painting fiasco. So this is a very interesting story that could only, of course, happen within the Soviet Union. And this is the case where Moscow had sent two shipping crates, one of them being cryptologic communications gear, new phones and stuff like that for the Soviet embassy, which was, of course, the staging area for a lot of espionage stuff in London. So Moscow, in their infinite wisdom, sent this crypto normal mail, where, of course, the British intelligence, MI6, would have intercepted it, taken everything apart, made sure that they understood, like, it's the worst spy tradecraft ever. You send your cryptologic keys via the regular mail instead of a diplomatic pouch. So Kondrashev sees this and says, wait a minute, this gigantic crate that we've got here in the office came via normal mail. It came on a ship instead of in a diplomatic pouch. This is not going to do. The Brits have already cracked all this stuff, so send it back. Well, basically, one of the lower ranking agents in the office, who was also running sources and thus very, very important at the time, one of Kondrashev's lackeys, ended up putting the shipping label to return it to Moscow on the wrong box. And so he writes this nice little label and nice letter to Moscow saying, don't worry about it. We did not need this stuff after all. You can have it back. And this was supposed to go on the box of telephones and cryptologic gear. The box that it was really put on was a crate of paintings of the Politburo members. So this idiot ended up putting a shipping label, "Return to sender," on a crate of Politburo members and Stalin himself. Can you imagine the coup that would have created back in Moscow? Their spies in London saying, "Oh, no, we don't need pictures of the Politburo. Don't worry about it. We don't care about those guys." They would have all been shot immediately if this had actually gone back. So this guy runs into Kondrashev's office, runs up to him and says, just completely out of breath, saying, "Oh my God, I unboxed the crate of paintings of Politburo members, and inside was the cryptologic gear that was supposed to be sent back." So Kondrashev says, "You mixed up the boxes? What an idiot." So they rush to the port to find out that the ship with the crate of Politburo members' paintings had already left port. So they get on this boat and just intercept this thing on the high seas to get this one crate back. So finally, they're able to get it back, because if it had made it all the way back to Russia, man, they would have been crucified for that. So Kondrashev gets back and says, "You know what? This is a big deal." So they have to kind of explain to the ambassador what had gone on. And again, this small details in this book show how wily Kondrashev was, and he was definitely a spy master in the most traditional word. Kondrashev tells the ambassador of the story, and the ambassador, of course, flies into the rage that you would have expected, because this probably could have ended with him getting a bullet as well. So the ambassador says, "All right, take down this telegram immediately. Send it back to Moscow. We're gonna expel this guy. We're gonna send a replacement immediately. He's going back on the first plane we can get him on back to Moscow." And Kondrashev says, "All right, cool. I'll take this down." But Kondrashev goes to the radio telegraph operator for the Russian embassy, and he says to him, "All right, here, I've got this message from the ambassador, and I want you to send this message. But what I also want you to do is keep the line open and send through my message as well, which is a higher priority message." So that message contains basically a promote at all costs protection kind of order for this guy that screwed up the labels on the boxes. Now, Kondrashev would have perfectly been okay with letting this guy go back to Moscow, but he was working sources, and the ambassador, in his rage, was not copacetic enough to understand that, look, this guy's an idiot, and I'm going to keep him locked away, and he's never going to do anything stupid again, but we need to keep him here because he's working sources that I can't work just yet. But the ambassador was not hearing any of that. The ambassador wanted him gone immediately. So Kondrashev sends through his message, which included a promotion order for this aide that screwed up. So the next morning, before he had even gotten a message back to his own demand that this guy be removed, the KGB chief of the entire KGB, which of course outranked the ambassador, issued like an Order of the Red Star, like a good job certificate, award, medal kind of thing for the guy who screwed up, which basically told the ambassador in no uncertain terms that this guy's going to stay because he's doing work that's way more important than you. So I thought that was a very interesting spin on what would be a comedic story. And just like the author mentions in the book, is that this crisis started and ended just the same. It started with lunacy and it ended with complete and utter lunacy. Such is the theme of the KGB throughout their entire history. Very, very interesting stuff. Moving on to Chapter 6, we learn a little bit more from a different angle regarding the story of George Blake. Now, George Blake is a very infamous man. He is a traitor of the highest order, at least for the British and the American side of things. And this is one of the most important things that Kondrashev actually revealed in this book. Now, George Blake, like I mentioned, is a very infamous mole within MI6. And he became a double agent for the KGB very, very early on. And the reason that his story is famous and how there are many books written about George Blake is that he was one of the most high-ranking spies the KGB had at the time. In fact, one of the things that plagued the KGB, particularly throughout this book and throughout the KGB's history, is the KGB had spies that were too good to use. And here's a perfect example of this. George Blake revealed to the Soviets the plans for the CIA and MI6 and the Western powers to physically dig a tunnel from West Germany to East Germany, in which they would, from underground, tap into Soviet communications cables. Through George Blake, the Soviets found out about this plan before the first shovel full of dirt was even moved. And the Soviets kind of kept tabs on this because it just so turned out that George Blake was the man who was in charge of this whole project. So this puts the KGB in quite a pickle because George Blake's notoriety was so high. He was so deeply embedded with this project. Now, if you're new to the world of espionage, what you might do is you might say, all right, let's wait till the Americans and the CIA dig this tunnel, and then we're just going to miraculously stumble across it. Well, again, we're in the world of international intrigue and political détente. And if you were to do that, if the Soviets were to miraculously discover this espionage attempt, the CIA would say, wait a minute, this was a really secret plan, and there is no way that they would have been able to find this just by happenstance. So we're going to scrub our files, and we're going to find out if there was a mole involved. And this puts George Blake at risk, right? So the KGB, again, was in this pickle because they couldn't very well destroy the tunnel, and they couldn't even pass fake information across it, because what the CIA would have done is, if, let's say, the KGB says, oh, wait a minute, these guys are listening, so let's pass some fake information through these communications wires, the CIA will pick that up, and they'll be tricked, right? Well, the CIA is not entirely stupid, and they would have corroborated a lot of the information. In the very minute that the CIA detected that fake information was going through these wires, the jig would be up. And the CIA would know, wait a minute, they're on to us. Because you never pass fake information unless you know the enemy's listening. So, again, this tunnel had to be left alone. The KGB knew that their communications were being tapped into by this tunnel, and they could do absolutely nothing about it. They couldn't even pass fake information. They couldn't do anything for about a year. And the book actually mentions that over 1,750 intelligence reports, high-level intelligence reports, were generated based off of 400,000 phone calls between senior East German military officers and their staff. So again, this kind of points out some of the difficulties of working in international espionage. It's not as simple as you might think. Now, this chapter kind of skips it forward a little bit in time, and Blake eventually gets discovered. He gets kind of ratted out as a mole by Polish intelligence, where an intelligence report that Kondrashev said, don't send out, this is too hot, this is too good of an information. Some opportunistic KGB agent said, wait a minute, the Polish need to know about this particular bit of information, which just so happened to be a list of all of the agents within Poland. So they pass that information along. The CIA picks it up because they have a mole in MI6, and Blake gets discovered. But that's many years down the line. For now, the KGB have got to just kind of suck it up and let their military secrets pass along this communications cable until they can find a plausible way of discovering this tunnel miraculously, right? So as we can see, now that we're into the meaty part of the book, things get very complicated. Things start getting a little bit out of hand when it comes to the details of some of this stuff. So again, you've just kind of got to read it yourself, but if you're looking for a high-level wavetop kind of thing, this is about the best we can do because this is very, very complicated stuff. Moving on from chapter 6, we have the next chapter, which is titled, Why Do You Need All Those People Here? And this details Kondrashev's experience with the East German Stasi. For those of you who are looking to get a little bit more information on the insides and inner workings of the Stasi, you're really not going to get it. This is kind of a short chapter, and it kind of details just some of the inner workings of how the Stasi worked. And it just so turned out that the KGB, the Russian KGB, of course, had liaisons for the East German Stasi, and the line that kind of dictates this chapter is referring to the East Germans remarking, "Why do you guys have so many people here? Why do you have so many KGB agents when we've got this well in hand?" So this chapter details mostly what the Stasi was after, which is hunting ex-Nazis, of course, being East Germany and West Germany and that whole kind of fiasco there. The East Germans were very much concerned with hunting down a lot of the surviving Nazi networks post-war. So it kind of goes into a little bit of detail there. But again, it's not that this chapter was not that interesting to me. One of the more interesting parts of this chapter is Kondrashev again escaping his, saving his own neck just barely. It just so turned out that another random chance where Kondrashev almost gets a bullet is where he was working a source, and he figured out this source is probably not a good source. We're going to have to probably just pass on them. Well, he went on vacation for a couple of weeks, and the guy that he put in charge of his work while he was gone rubber-stamped approved this guy as a source. It turns out later on down the line, this guy turned out to be a double agent, a spy. And of course, the KGB finds out about this, and it's a whole scandal. And who's the KGB come after? The guy who recruited this spy. Well, they bring Kondrashev in for interrogation, and he holds up, his proof, his passport that shows that he was on vacation during the dates when this guy was approved, and it was really somebody else who got the bullet instead of Kondrashev. Again, just escaping on pure happenstance, and shows the importance of keeping those receipts, right? Moving on to Chapter 8, which is titled A Unique Look at the Hungarian Revolution. Not that interesting to me, to be honest. It's mostly details the reasons why the Soviets wanted to protect their interest in Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution. Moving on again to Chapter 9, Spy Center Vienna. Sort of the same thing. It just kind of talks about the reworking of the espionage cases in Austria. Very, very sparse details. It mostly details Kondrashev's interactions with Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Kennedy-Khrushchev visit there, and how they were kind of slipped amongst the political delegation to be spies there. But again, very few details. Kondrashev was kind of tight-lipped about this one. Moving on to Chapter 10, this is, again, remember that seed I planted earlier? This is where we start to give it a little bit of water and let it grow, and kind of realize that something may be going on here. There's something that's off with this. This chapter kind of gave me doubt the source vibes. And this is because this details, among other things, Kondrashev's personal involvement with the Gestapo Mueller story. Now, again, this is a story that you should probably just research on your own. The capture of Heinrich Müller and his use by the KGB to kind of run networks throughout Eastern Germany and kind of root out some of this dissension and cause a little bit of trouble with the West. Basically, the KGB used high-ranking Nazis that they captured against the West, using them because they spoke German. They were more than willing to cooperate with the Soviets or otherwise get a bullet, and they were able to run a lot of their high-ranking networks and communities throughout Germany to kind of sow discord with the West. So this comes in a little bit of the more active measures that we're going to come to in a bit, but the whole story about how much Gestapo Mueller, Heinrich Müller was his real name, how much he was used is a little bit far-fetched to me. We know that he was a very high-ranking Nazi official that was used by the KGB, but I don't know, just reading it, it kind of gives me the vibes that maybe the KGB wants us to think that these guys were a lot better espionage source than they actually were. I don't think they were as effective as the KGB wants us to think, and I think that their use of Gestapo Mueller was a little bit over-exaggerated. It just kind of gives me that vibe. Again, just kind of bringing into question the source and the source's motivations, as we'll get to at the end. Chapter 11 is kind of a strong departure from all the previous chapters, in which Kondrashev goes to the movies and gets an idea. He saw a film about Richard Sorge, who was a very well-known Russian spy in Japan prior to World War II. So Sorge's story has become a Russian folk tale of patriotism and all kinds of stuff, right? He was made hero of the Soviet Union for his actions, and the reason that he is reflected positively in history is due to Kondrashev. Kondrashev realized that this guy's story, at the time, he was just kind of cast aside, but Kondrashev wanted to make this spy well known. because his story was very patriotic and had a lot of propaganda value. So Kondrashev knocked together a plan to make a few movies about the guy and give him, make him posthumously hero of the Soviet Union, and that's basically what this chapter is about. We kind of get the idea of Kondrashev branching out and starting to influence information, which is directly related to the next chapter, which is organizing to disinform. This, I think, is where we start to see the beginnings of fifth-generation warfare. This is where we start seeing what the Soviets called, and what Kondrashev calls here, active measures. Basically, the organization of how the Soviet Union was going to basically undermine the West in every possible facet of existence. So this chapter details how everything was kind of organized through Kondrashev's kind of, not his direct leadership, but it was his idea, and how he helped organize the whole process through his subordinates and stuff like that. Because you got to remember, at this time, Kondrashev was a fairly high-ranking person. He shouldn't be running small operations. He's running big stuff. And this was a massive campaign to basically undermine the West in 5 different ways. So they organized this effort of active measures into 5 categories: political, economic, scientific, military, and counterintelligence. These 5 fields would be used to basically, again, propagandize and use information warfare to the absolute utmost. This is really where we start to see the beginnings, again, of fifth-generation warfare, of information warfare itself. This is where this kind of thing comes into really existence, I think. For instance, in moving on to the next chapter, which details some of these active measures and just the lengths that the Soviets were willing to go to get information and to undermine the West, it's amazing. For instance, one of the things they did was they used the movie Dr. Strangelove to paint American personnel, Air Force personnel, as reckless. So what they did was, the Soviets had no role, or at least Kondrashev says they had no role in producing the movie Dr. Strangelove. They had no interest in it. However, once it came out, they used it to their advantage, such as they generated a fake letter from a high-ranking Air Force official, and then they leaked it to the press. And this fake letter, detailed how 2/3 of all flight crews had become, quote, psychotic, irrational, and depressive after flying with nuclear weapons. So again, the press wanted to make it look like the American government really was Dr. Strangelove, like it was more of a documentary than a satirical art piece, right? And the Soviets jumped on that and started pushing a lot of these fake leaked documents all around the world. Some genuine, some fake, and some of the genuine ones were more fake than you might think. So again, this is the era of active measures where the KGB used a lot of fake leaks, a lot of fake information, a lot of classic haversack ruses as well to discredit spies and basically start wild goose chases. This is also the chapter, switching gears quite significantly, where the tunnel comes to an end, and the Soviets miraculously discovered it because they had found a way of revealing the tunnel without giving up George Blake as being the guy. Because if they had fingered George Blake as the spy from the very, very beginning, then all of the intelligence that they gained through the tunnel was doomed to be suspect, right? So a very, very interesting end to that story. Chapter 14 details some of the more classic stuff. Now we're starting to get into the very, very complicated double-crossing, right? So this details the false defection of Yuri Nasenko. And this was an operation that was ran by Gribanov, who was basically the head of Soviet counterintelligence. Kondrashev was brought on board by Gribanov, but eventually Kondrashev said, "Hey, this is not good. I need to move on." Because Gribanov was rash and reckless. So the general plan was for Gribanov to get this guy named Yuri Nasenko, another high-ranking intelligence officer within the KGB, and Nasenko was going to pretend to defect to the CIA. And once implanted in the CIA as an agent and once being run by the CIA's case officers, Nasenko could feed fake information to the CIA and thus be basically a double agent. This did not work very, very well. The CIA was suspicious of Nasenko from the very start, but again, the CIA, throughout this book and throughout other books, the CIA does not look very good. And this, just taking a break from this book for a moment, this is a trend that kind of comes up, and I hate to ascribe it to be more cultural, but it's definitely the case. For instance, I personally think, and I think it's quite clear throughout history, that the Russians, the Soviets, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a Soviet thing, they just understand intelligence and espionage and spy work. They are just fantastic at it. They're really, really, really good at counterintelligence as well. And this is kind of the thing that you get because, for instance, the CIA was very, very suspicious of Nasenko because of the people that he kind of hung out with looked an awful lot suspicious, right? So it looked an awful lot like Nasenko was a double agent, but they never acted on it. And that's why this chapter is titled, How Could the CIA Ever Have Believed in That Man? Because from Kondrashev's perspective, Kondrashev looked and said, look, there is no way the CIA is going to believe this guy. He's the most obvious double agent in the history of espionage. And yet, the CIA ate it up pretty good. So even though Gribanov was very, very reckless and mishandled the whole project, and how Nasenko himself was not very convincing, the CIA bought it. At least enough, even though they were suspicious, they bought it enough for that mission to be a decent success. Now, on the other side of the aisle was, again, yet another case of a source being so good the KGB could not do anything about it. And this was the counterintelligence case of Oleg Penkovsky. This guy was a real double agent. He was a KGB agent who defected to the West secretly and wanted to work for the CIA. Well, the KGB had a mole within the CIA, and they found out that old Oleg here was dealing in secrets, but that source was too good for them to reveal them knowing about Oleg. So years down the line, they basically had to feign incompetence. The KGB had to pretend that they did not know that Oleg was a spy until they could find enough plausible evidence to hang around his neck. So basically, they had to pretend to be incompetent, like letting their, counterintelligence guys, their stompers, be caught. They had to let their dead drops be very, very bad, right? They had to be discovered surveilling Oleg by the CIA, and then the CIA had to catch on by saying, "Wait a minute, they're on to old Oleg here, so we've got to move on." Now, one of the frustrating parts of this book is that we will never know. Well, I don't know about never, but we don't know yet who that spy was who outed Oleg. We do not know. Kondrashev took that source to his grave, and it's one of the largest debates since the Cold War. It must have been a high-ranking spy as to who was the leak, who was the mole. We just don't know. Moving on to chapter 15, another similar interesting story, which was called The Top Hat Paradox. And this is this story of Dmitry Polyakov. This guy was, again, a fake defector, run much like Nasenko, but a lot more competently. As a matter of fact, Polyakov was, at the time, the CIA classified him as the jewel in the crown. He was the highest-ranking spy the CIA had. He was the best spy in the KGB, in the Russian system. And it turned out the KGB was running him as a double agent the entire time. So in actuality, one of the more interesting things and one of the smaller shocking revelations from this book is that the KGB actually assassinated him for being a double agent because, as Kondrashev points out, he was a double agent, but he shared more information than he was supposed to. So in essence, Polyakov was basically a triple agent trying to play both sides of the aisle. Very, very interesting, and it kind of brings back Agent Zigzag from a different book. Agent Zigzag being Eddie Chapman, a guy who played both sides of the aisle between the British and the Germans. We have kind of a similar story here where Polyakov was a double agent who was secretly working for the KGB, but pretending to work for the CIA, but actually giving the CIA some really good information. So it's not quite clear as to how the story worked out because, again, Kondrashev took most of the details of the story to his grave. Again, leaving us quite dissatisfied with the ending of that story, but again, these are the ways of the espionage world. Moving through the rest of the chapters, we kind of have to move quickly because they're not really important. The chapter 16 is about the Czechoslovakian reformations and how Czechoslovakia was going through some tough times, and they were basically experiencing a crisis of command, essentially. So this details the KGB sending Kondrashev and his team to spy on a lot of the political meetings that were occurring in the nation at the time, before, obviously, the Bratislav invasion by the Soviets. So again, that's kind of how that went. And chapter 17 kind of details the final years of Kondrashev's career, where he basically was so high-ranking that he didn't really move up the ladder anymore. He just kind of sidestepped the ladder rungs to move laterally a lot. And he enjoyed himself quite greatly. He went to Iran and Afghanistan and did quite a bit on the Chinese border and the Mongolian border. Not a whole lot of details in this chapter because it's basically just him helping out his underlings where he could, because he was basically like that emeritus professor that kind of comes back to teach one course every semester, and they just kind of hang out a lot. That's basically where Kondrashev was at in his career. And chapters 18 and 19 are kind of the beginning of the end, where Kondrashev details the Helsinki Accords, which again put pressure on the USSR. Again, these details are not really relevant to Kondrashev's story, but it kind of wraps up how the Soviet Union just kind of ended, and ended rather abruptly. And in hindsight, we absolutely could have seen it coming, but at the time, even within the Soviet system, very few people knew what was going on. So one part about this book that I really, really wish I had the physical version for instead of an ebook here is the epilogue and the appendix. I don't know why the author did this. I guess maybe because he wanted to get the book out rather quickly before someone else did. But the appendix is probably the most valuable part of the whole book. So if I were to do this all over again, I would get a physical copy of this book. I was not able to get it in time for this first book club meeting. It's still in the mail, but I wish I had it because the notes in each one of these chapters point to the appendix and give you a lot of amplifying information. So I personally think that the appendix is just as valuable as the main text. So if you buy this book and if you want to read it yourself, don't just stop reading when you get to the appendix. Read the whole appendix because it's a very, very interesting read. And I personally think that it contains a lot of details about Kondrashev's personal life and his family heritage and stuff that it should have been in the main text. They should have made it the appendix, chapter 1, and started there, but that's just my own personal opinion. So wrapping things up today, let me intersperse some of my own thoughts with some of your thoughts. Some of the comments that we've gotten from our supporters have been really, really insightful, so I wanted to kind of share them as I go through and mention some of my own thoughts. First of all is kind of the general frustration that this was a very interesting read, but again, Kondrashev was most certainly a quiet professional. He did not reveal any startling revelations except for a few things here and there. But mostly this was Kondrashev sharing some of the more interesting parts of his career that perhaps were a little bit too inflammatory for the publishing under, a Russian government, but they were certainly not anything particularly damning as far as his own nation. So Kondrashev, to the last, was most certainly no traitor. He did not reveal anything, and he kept a lot of secrets that could possibly be revealed today, and he kept those secrets to himself. So sort of along these same lines as to how Kondrashev was a very silent professional who wasn't exactly just the evil henchman behind the curtain that we expect the KGB to be. Derek from Patreon makes this point as well. He says that one of the more unexpected things I learned was how honorable the KGB was in trying to keep up their end of the deal with anyone who flipped for them. I thought that was pretty cool. He also mentions this is an overall decent read to gain insight into the Cold War espionage mentalities in general. Also, this monthly book idea was great. Ready for the next one. So that's great. But yeah, Derek is absolutely right. One of the things you kind of get early on is how the KGB did not just, use them and lose them kind of thing. They did not just drop these sources unless they absolutely had to save their own skin as a case officer, like the Beria story. Most of the time, the KGB actually tried to take care of people as best they could. Even if they used someone for just one small thing, they ended up putting them up into an apartment for the rest of their life, basically. So that's a very interesting thing. You don't necessarily get that vibe from a lot of intelligence services, especially some of the more darker history of the CIA, who is doesn't necessarily do that so much, just by and large. Now, that's kind of a gross statement, but from this book you get that perspective. Now, again, of course, there's always an element of, is this really true? I from my other readings of other books, this does seem to be quite true. The KGB was very invested in making sure that their sources did not, run off, because again, this is not something that the KGB did out of the goodness of their heart. They really wanted to take care of their sources to prevent them from being used by the West. So, according to the KGB, and if you're a huge nation state like the USSR, a huge conglomerate of just massive enterprises, right? It's going to cost nothing to put somebody up in an apartment for the rest of their life, or give them, a few $1,000 American, the equivalent of, just to go live a, quiet life in the Caribbean or something like that. It doesn't cost very much when you consider the alternative, which is that person could then go to the CIA and say, "Hey, I was a spy for the Russians. What are you going to pay me to spill my guts?" So yeah, it's very interesting how that kind of worked out. Another theme that it sounds bad to talk about, because you don't want to appear, and I certainly don't want to come across as being sort of like a pro-Russian propagandist because I read one book about a KGB chief, right? I'm taking other sources into consideration when I say this, but you get this feeling from this book that the CIA were not particularly good at their job. And this is something that others have noticed as well, such as, again, Saber from Patreon, who wrote, "The more I read about the Cold War, the more it seems like American intelligence is behind the curve. Even as far back as World War I, the British and others were running circles around us. If you follow current events, it doesn't seem like it improved much either. Why is that? Why do the CIA/FBI make themselves look unwilling or unable to process intelligence?" So, yeah, I agree. It certainly does seem that way. And again, I don't want to make it seem like the KGB was the ultimate intelligence service of all time, right? There's a reason the CIA and the KGB were up against each other, right? And who ended up winning in the end, right? It certainly wasn't the USSR. They ended up collapsing. So, that of course had very little to do with the KGB itself. But the bottom line is that if we're wanting to keep as neutral of a point, or neutral of a view of history as we possibly can, it's still really hard to come up and say, you know what, the CIA was just as good as the KGB in most things they did, because it certainly doesn't seem that way. Even MI6 definitely outpaced the CIA and the FBI for a lot of their history. I mean, for instance, Russia was running spies in Japan, and they were just absolutely devastating the world of intelligence throughout Europe before the CIA and the FBI and MI6 even existed. So you've got to admit they have history on their side, which is perhaps why this definitely seems to be the case. But in this book, there are many cases where the KGB and Kondrashev in particular said, there is no way the CIA is going to be this stupid to believe this. And they did. There were also a lot of times where Kondrashev notes, we're going to get caught for sure. The CIA, man, if they're not spying on us in this particular situation, they're missing out. And they actually were missing out. So there are a lot of missed opportunities for the CIA, particularly in East Berlin. But yeah, that's a very interesting take, and it's something that's kind of hard to get around. As far as the modern day questions, I think that the national intelligence services today, if we want to make draw a parallel from it, I think they rely on technology, to do most of the things that they used to do manually. This is, because I was an intelligence analyst for the U.S. government for many years, I can definitely say that my experiences are that the National Intelligence Services today rely on technology way too much and on critical thinking way too little. Why do you think there is such an emphasis on domestic spying these days? Well, because you have to, when you're not good at critical thinking, you have to spy on everyone and kind of take the Sherlock Holmes deductive reasoning approach rather than inductive reasoning. So when everyone's under surveillance, it's very easy to do that sort of thing. So again, it seems like on a critical thinking level, it's just really hard to do, whereas for the Russians, at least, even to this day, there is just something special about the Russian people who are able to be vastly superior at all things intelligence, counterintelligence, and espionage in general. I don't know what it is, but it's just kind of the way that it is as far as I see it. And finally, I wanted to kind of wrap up and kind of touch on what I've mentioned so far, which is that spy tradecraft is not really discussed in this book. But the office work necessary for any kind of success is discussed. And that's kind of an interesting thing that I wanted to point out, because I myself, man, I love some good spy tradecraft because I think it's interesting and there's very little out there on it, right? It's if we're trying to draw some parallels to today's world, I think that the tradecraft stuff is what gets people hooked, right? It's the interesting stuff, the cool little spy, Jason Bourne little tips that kind of allow people to have a better view of what the world is and how to navigate within it. But that's not really in this book. Sure, there is quite a lot of tradecraft, honestly, but it's not the kind of stuff that you would imagine. Kondrashev really just talks about it like he's getting a sandwich from the fridge, like he does a dead drop, this day or that day. He doesn't really focus on the tradecraft so much as the motivation behind it, which is fantastic, I think, but it can be a bit burdensome for others. As Sean points out from Patreon, he writes, I thought the book was somewhat interesting from a historical standpoint, but I thought it to be at too high of a level to be a useful source on anything, really. If I was an intelligence resource for a big government or a history buff, maybe it would be useful for ideas. The info on drugging the cat to get the one person's wife out of the house so they could plant listening devices was a thought-provoking tidbit. The part about planting stories in the media may be useful in some way, and the letter writing maybe. No big revelations, though, from the book. And I totally get it. I totally agree. It is not exactly what it's painted to be based on the title of the book, but it's also a bit too high level in a lot of places. It's more of a strategic thing to where if you're somebody like me, you might find it interesting and it might be pretty cool. Clearly, Tenant Bagley thought it was very, very cool, but that does not translate to everyone. So if I'm the researcher, if I'm going to make some content using this book, I've got to cherry pick, right? I've got to pick and choose the tidbits of information that people might find interesting in order to get that hook in them, in order to actually show, well, the dead drops are maybe not the most useful part of this story. The 5 or 6 months of work leading up to that, now that might be interesting. Again, I completely agree that the book needed to probably discuss tradecraft a lot more. If nothing else more than Tenant Bagley, he could have explained some of the more spy tricks that were used by Kondrashev that Kondrashev just kind of glossed over quite a lot. But that was kind of a missed opportunity on his part. But again, if I were to use this as an academic resource, it would have to be very, very specific cases. So yeah, all in all, a very, very interesting book. I think that it's worth reading if you have not read anything regarding this before, but be mindful that you might be a little bit disappointed if you were expecting some spy thriller. You really have to know a lot more of the dry, boring side of intel and counterintelligence and how the KGB kind of operated beforehand. So if, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, if you're not necessarily into the history of the Cold War and you don't have a larger understanding of some of these things, for instance, Czechoslovakia just came out of nowhere. His work in Vienna was, again, not really stressed as to, well, why is he going to Vienna? Why is this important? Well, if you know history, you know that Vienna was a very, very high-level spy ring for the Soviets. It was a very convenient spy base for them throughout the region. Same thing with Czechoslovakia and their subsequent transition, I should say. So yeah, you really kind of have to have a brief understanding of history. If you go into this and you don't know anything about it at all, you're going to be, I think, disappointed. But other than that, this, I think, was a very good start, a very good way to start thinking about how we can learn together and some of the things that we can maybe bring to today's world. When it comes to spy stuff, it's arguable as to how much you can actually use in today's world, but I do think that one of the things that this book could not teach, and I don't think anyone can teach, is critical thinking. Kondrashev just had instincts that no one can really even describe, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why his miraculous rise to fame and his miraculous rise within the KGB was as miraculous as it was. It wasn't necessarily some kind of nefariousness of him ratting out his co-workers or anything like that. I think that Kondrashev was just a very, very special person who had a very, very special critical thinking ability that I don't think any of us could really understand. And he's not alone. There are many, many other figures just like this on all sides of the conflict. And I think it's very interesting to examine some of these very, very important people and very interesting people for a modern world. Because like many of you have mentioned, a lot of this stuff carries over directly to the unique lifestyles that I think a lot of us are having to live in today's world. So I think we'll just leave it at that. We'll close things up for this time, and we will come back next time with yet another book. Thank you again for watching, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your support, and thank you for engaging with this. This really is, it helps me just as much as it helps you. So thank you again for all of your great, great ideas. I wish I could put them all in this video, but quite a lot of you have had some very, very important and astute observations of stuff that I've kind of missed, to be honest. So thank you again for all of that, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.